Hi there, and welcome to this module of Made Sense, in which I'm going to talk about beliefs again. In particular, I'm going to talk about how a belief in omnipotence can arise. So omnipotence is an extreme case of an interpretation of what voices are capable of. So this is one of the sort of very common problems with people who hear voices, is we're experiencing this thing that is unusual. Our concept of it is that it is supernatural. And I always add that, supernatural simply means as yet unexplained. It's clearly a natural phenomenon. We just haven't yet been able to explain it, in part because we haven't actually even been looking at it really for that matter. So one of the things that leads to, of course, is you're asking all these questions about what it is. Voices are then asserting all these characters, most of which are not exactly helpful. They're getting in the way of your life. They're introducing conflict. They're claiming they can do things. And of course, you're then looking for evidence that they can or can't do stuff. And of course, as you know now from the belief engine story, when you're looking for evidence in a field full of uncertainty, you find evidence. Even though it isn't real evidence, all you're doing is you're finding a piece of information that strengthens the belief. And in this case, the belief is less a belief than it's a doubt. So of course, we're finding evidence that sort of that emphasizes the doubt. And of course, we're quite risk averse naturally. So what we do is we sort of compensate for it, and we overcompensate. So omnipotence, as I say, is an extreme example. There are many other examples. As I say, my voice has made me very sensitive to the theme of technology. Very early on, when I thought it was my neighbors spying on me, and I sort of started to investigate that technology was the means for doing that. Ever since then, my voices have been very, very busy whenever I've worked, with technology. So every time I've sat down to the PC, my voices get very, very busy. It's not as bad now, but I mean, there was a period where it took me 10 times as long as it should do to create a simple PowerPoint slide like this, because voices were badgering me so much. So omnipotence, I say, is an extreme example of an interpretation of the capability of voices. What we're doing here is we're saying, voices are kind of all powerful, and that's what voices are trying to assert. In reality, we have very many degrees of that. And, we certainly, all of us who hear voices will tell stories of, coming across someone who says something that you kind of think, how on earth did they actually know that? In the sense that it's, what they've said kind of connects to your story with voices. It's this interaction with this thing that I haven't shared with this person, and yet this person is saying something that somehow connects to that. And part of it is our kind of suspicious nature, not of the person, but of voices. This is the problem. The person sometimes reads it as suspicious of them. And it pretty much all arises from this whole idea that we are connected to this something, whatever it is. We're experiencing it as not me, as something else. And of course, voices then are asserting this connection between us. As I've mentioned this before, they use this language, pretty boy, you can't swear on the web. The web is one name that my voices have used for this thing that connects us. They, of course, also claim that when I say us, I mean voices and I. And of course, they also claim that there is a connection between us humans. And of course, we do know that certainly when we're close to each other, we read someone else's emotions, and that certainly feels like a connection between us. And there may well be, who knows? But really, what voices are doing is asserting that there is one, and that they can interfere in it, and that they can actually shape the thinking of others. Of course, I dismiss that simply by saying voices may be able to insert topics and ideas in my mind, but there's very little evidence that they can actually influence what I'm doing or what I'm saying. What they certainly can do is influence my perception by distorting signals. So, and for me, even in the worst case scenario, let's actually say voices could actually influence someone else nearby me. I simply dismiss it by kind of saying, okay, if that's possible, then could they influence what someone else is saying? Well, maybe. And I kind of simply say, well, okay, so what? I don't think that people will act outside of their values. So at the very worst, it's a minor and temporary problem, even though the experience of it can be much, much more frightening than that. But let me show you, say, the worst example of this, which is voices trying to establish a belief in their powers in the extreme, so as omnipotence. So I'm going to cover the sort of confusion and complication in the fray. So when voices are babbling at you and they've kind of set a scene and they're throwing all these things at you, I want to show you how the confusion and complication easily leads to this belief in omnipotence, because we are unable to keep track of the sort of chain of evidence, as it were. And then I'm going to highlight for you the sort of key takeaway from that for you, because of the sort of implications it has for how you view the world. So the basic idea that's sort of going on here is that the sort of belief in omnipotence arrives from shifting our focus to adjacent squares. So by an adjacent square, I simply mean a new frame of reference that is similar to this one. And of course, I might start to understand it in this one, and then my frame of reference is shifted to one that is similar, and I don't necessarily notice it, but that nuance is actually quite significant in terms of the sort of escalation from uncertainty about what voices are able to do, and then whilst they're sort of badgering you sort of in this sort of confusion, to reaching a conclusion that you then feel, gosh, I felt it, I experienced it, but then you can't quite trace the evidence. And of course, it's also important because about 30% of people who hear voices have religion thrust on them, and of course, a big part of that is you're believing that these voices are some kind of spirit entity, that is a buddy of God and or the devil, and has come to pester you for the rest of your life. And of course, you have no idea, because you believe, especially if you believe in God and that God is omnipotent. Of course, then of course you just fall prey to whatever voices claim is going to happen in your life. And so I say, they have religion thrust on them, and it comes in many forms. I mean, it doesn't have to be God and the devil, arguing, pulling me this way and that in my head as my voices try to do. I've seen people that have other characters and whatever they call them. So I met a woman who had the voice of wisdom and the voice of knowledge. But actually, they worked in the same way. They just introduced two conflicting ideas, and the poor woman was stuck in the middle, trying to sort out the conflict. And that's what happens: is people who experience religious content actually just talk about being caught in the middle of this war between good and evil, and that's exactly what it feels like. Voices are introducing these conflicting ideas. You have no evidence to prove, disprove either one of them, and of course, your mind is responding every time they throw this piece of information at you. And of course, you're trying to sort out this mess of this sort of conflict between good and evil. And so it occupies the mind because it introduces this conflict. And the way to do it, as I say, is to minimize it. The experience of it is to simply decide that evil has no place. So I rejected the idea that our voices were either God or the devil, of course, who is a creation of his buddy God. And for me, I kind of simply said, voices, you're trying to impose evil on me. My experience of the real world is one of love and respect. And that's what I'm going to rely on, and I'm going to ignore you. That's my sort of approach to kind of dealing with it. The second point to make is that actually many of us are the second coming. And I'm saying this because obviously I'm talking here about my voices declaring that I am the second coming. And of course, I just missed that for a very long time. And then at some point, I kind of said, okay, I'm tired of just rejecting this. I played along. And of course, either way, whether I was dismissing it or playing along, I was still subjected to having the experience thrust on me. I just want to point out that actually amongst the 30% of people who hear voices, there are a fair number whose voices have told them they are the second coming. So there's a lot of second comings in waiting, as it were. I'm not the only one who has that experience. But of course, that sort of declaration that you are the second coming, as my voices have done, is something that sort of sets the scene. So my voices introduced the idea of religion, first of all, with a lot of sort of back and forth about that. I think probably to test my beliefs on it. And of course, I don't believe in it. I believe in love and I believe in respect, and I don't attribute those to religion. I think that love and respect are innate, and that actually religion confuses the issue and gets in the way of that. So of course that became how the kind of scene was actually set, if you like. So my voices declared that I am the second coming, since I wasn't going to volunteer. They simply, declared that I am. So it was this assertion preceded by lots of suggestion that I might be. And of course, when I wasn't actually following that idea, that they kind of just asserted it kind of anyway. So this is them setting the scene, so religion, and then Greggy boy, you are the second coming, and will you rewrite the Bible and all this kind of nonsense. So they set this whole sort of context, and this has gone on for months. And of course, they're very, very busy. And of course, this Jack in the Box is, of course, creating all these kinds of special effects. And of course, if you remember the belief engine, voices are actually interjecting and intervening in my thinking at every step of the way. So every little thought, my voices are making a comment on and trying to nudge me in a particular direction. And of course, it's this nudging into an adjacent square, a similar frame of reference that leads to this kind of idea in omnipotence. So I'm just going to go through this kind of, I'm going to zigzag from left to right and go down that way, because this is kind of more or less how the sort of logic flows. So this is kind of more or less, roughly the piece that I'm sort of observing, or sort of, is being thrust into my aware mind. And then this is the inference I'm making, but aided and abetted by lots of interference from voices, and of course the special effects that they add. And of course the special effects are this kind of distortion of signal strength. So when I'm processing, I'm seeing things with an exaggerated signal. I'm recognizing bits of information at an exaggerated kind of signal strength. And of course, every comment that voices make is shifting my frame of reference a little, and I'm not aware of that. And certainly not in the busyness of it. Remember, this is happening at the kind of, at the speed of thought. But the piece that, that I know for certain is that voices know my every thought, because they're interacting with it. That's the point of this sort of hearing voices thing, is I'm hearing voices talking to me, and my thoughts are expressed as the other half of a conversation. So it's not unreasonable for me to infer that if they know my thoughts and they're connected via this web, and I seem to have some evidence of that because I've seen people, heard people around me say stuff, and I kind of think, how on earth could they possibly come up with those words, which are so specific to my relationship with voices? They tend to be meaningless and incidental, for want of another description. They're not in and of themselves threatening. The threatening piece is that they've used words that I can only relate to my experience with voices. It's not that they're about to sort of harm me or any of this kind of thing. It just makes you ask the question, how on earth did that person find those specific words in this, and use them when sort of talking to me, because they seem so specific to my voices. So very quickly you reach the inference that because voices clearly know my thoughts, they know the thoughts of others. And of course, because I've experienced some of these things with this very strong signal strength, I'm still on the lookout. I'm either looking on the lookout. In fact, in this case, it's actually I'm suspicious, so I'm trying to prove that voices don't have all of these powers that they're asserting. Because in fact, my overall experience of life is that actually they don't have an influence on others. They don't have an influence on my behavior. They do obviously have an influence on what I'm thinking about. But anyway, so I'm looking for evidence in this frame of mind of kind of uncertainty. Someone else comes along that says something that fits the story that voices have sort of planted, or actually have occasionally sometimes sort of specific words. So there's the two versions there. People, somebody I'm talking to might use words that are so specific to my experience with voices. At other times, it might just be that voices have kind of planted a suggestion. And of course, when a suggestion is confirmed, it actually sort of gains credence by this strengthened signal. And of course, that experience then leads you to kind of be convinced that actually the voices do know everyone's thoughts. So then voices then sort of jump on that bandwagon and actually say, okay, they know everything. So this is then voices working with that and claiming then to know everything. So voices are then kind of claiming to be omniscient, to kind of knowing everything. And of course, this is the adjacent square thing. This is the deception. So omniscience is actually more than knowing what people think, because they're kind of shifting this to kind of not just knowing what voices, knowing what other people think, but knowing what other people will think. So this becomes all knowing rather than simply knowing someone's thoughts. And this is what I mean by an adjacent square. That little slight shift, in voices sort of claiming that they know everything based on my questioning whether or not they actually know what other people are thinking, is this shift to an adjacent square that actually gives voices much, much more power than they had at this level of belief and uncertainty, if you like. So they've jumped on that uncertainty and turned knowing everyone's thoughts into omniscience, as I say, omniscience, which is knowing what people will think and knowing everything, okay? And of course, now I'm continuing to look for evidence again. And of course, then voices sort of claim sort of prior knowledge of it and sort of future knowledge of it. And of course, using that to sort of make prophecies and predictions. So this omniscience soon becomes voices knowing what people will do, not just what they think and being all-knowing, but actually knowing what people will do. And that's omnipotence already right there. So voices are then kind of saying they know what everybody will do. So everything is everything is actually preordained, is where that sort of heads to. So this then, that kind of realization is that, which is reinforced by this, again, the strong signal strength with these special effects of the sort of jack in the box. And very soon I've inferred that everything is ordained. In other words, that voices actually know what it is. And then of course I rationalize it by kind of saying everything happens for a reason. And those are actually not the same things, the idea that everything is ordained and everything happens for a reason. And that's another one of those little adjacent square kinds of shifts. And of course, everything happens for a reason is just a nice romantic interpretation and explanation of this idea that something, that everything is ordained. We're happy to believe that everything happens for a reason. We're less happy to believe that everything is ordained, because if everything is ordained, what's the point? I mean, then there's no point in us living, because it means we have no choice at all. And of course, that's exactly what voices are trying to do, is they're trying to remove choice. But I've gone from omnipotence to everything is ordained, and then rationalizing it by saying everything happens for a reason. And those are these small shifts in frames of reference that I'm calling adjacent squares. So, then I believe that everything is ordained, but my life is actually being controlled by voices, and then these things up here have a much, much higher significance again, and a much, much stronger kind of suggestion. And the way voices play with this actually is that they then try and reinforce this belief, and they do it by doing two things. When things go well, they kind of claim credit for it. Oh, it was us that allowed this to happen. We brought this person into your life, and that's the reason this happened. And when things don't go well, they simply blame me. Oh, you didn't do this. I told you to do this, and you haven't done it. So of course we're not going to do this for you, and that's why this didn't happen. So what happens is that they're either claiming credit for it, and of course or they're blaming for us. And of course our religious texts are full of this. It's this sort of promise and threat, that we call a covenant. And of course all that's happened is voices have sort of played the odds and the statistics. They claim credit when things go well, so that we will attribute all the good stuff to them. And when things go bad, they say, well, actually, you're a sinner and you're not believing and you're not doing what I expected of you. So it's your fault. And that's pretty much, say, what you're seeing in our religious texts is the experience of it in the mind. This is why I kind of say, amusingly, that I am the second coming and I'm not the second coming. I'm not the second coming because I don't believe, that Christ was the Son of God in the first place. Only that, that this character that claimed himself to be God, that exists in this other entity, just, claimed it to be so. And of course, I say I am the second coming from the point of view that I've had the experience of it. And I say I'm one of many. I've just analyzed it in a different way. And of course, this whole idea of sort of taking credit and blame is the basis of the threats and promises that voices make. And of course, what's very important is when you're experiencing this and voices are throwing this information into your processor, and you're operating in this, at the speed of thought in this field of uncertainty and doubt, then the experience of these threats is very, very real. It's a really, really scary, scary stuff. Absolutely hideous, absolutely vile. I struggle to find the words to describe how hideous this experience of being the second coming to these miserable entities actually is. It's horrific. So key thing to take away from this is the implications of this kind of experience. Because at the very, even if you don't believe in omnipotence, which is the extreme belief that voices are trying to lead you to, you are still left with the experience of doubt about what voices are capable of. And that doubt is uncertainty, which is a threat that is then adjusting your brain to be hyper-vigilant and hyper-aware. And of course, every little piece of evidence that confirms the doubt is registered with a stronger signal and exaggerates the doubt. So what you have to do is you have to learn to reject this and kind of say, actually, I know I'm experiencing this in a way that is with these exaggerated signals and signal strengths. And the way I deal with it is say, I recognize that, I don't like it, I object to it, I reject it, and I simply say, I'm going to focus on the real world because my experience of people is love and respect. And that's something I can rely on. That has much more certainty and much less doubt to it. That's how I deal with it. And I'll show you how I do that in the tools in the kind of mind strategies section. Of course, the implications of these things is that what happens is, this is how I represent my story. So, sort of my activity, my mind, are both producing kind of stimuli and experiences, and I map my experience, to my story, which I represent in these sort of 5 frames of reference: me and my concept of self, my relationships, how I interact with people near, close, far, the stuff I do in my day, which is really this down here, how that relates to my future. And then, of course, because we're social beings, if my future has some value to our future, that's what actually will produce the strongest signals, reward signals in the mind. So don't worry about this detail yet, just focus on those 5 up there. So what's happening is, my day-to-day stuff is shaping my perception. My story, as I become more experienced in life, move around more, experience new things, my concept of the world actually, on our world grows, and of course of my place in our world. So I'm simply using these corners to represent perception and concept, concept of the world and my perception. And of course, my trajectory, if you like, is that sort of through life. And of course, what's happening is my voice is coming along and inserting this other world and claiming to be God and the devil and a whole host of spirit beings, all part of this same creation, which really is just a way for them to impose their concept of the world on us. And of course, you can see it in the revealed religions. They basically say this world is meaningless. What happens? What's important is the life hereafter. So, if you do all of these things and you believe in me, then I promise. Trust me, I promise. I'll make life interesting for you afterwards. You can come and sit by my side and be my buddy. Or if you don't believe in me, well, not sure what I've got in store for you. So what's happening, of course, is voices are sort of imposing this sort of concept of the world on us. If you're experiencing voices, this stuff is all very, very, very threatening and very, very real and downright hideous, okay? So what voices are doing is they're trying to connect their story to our story, their world to our world, and it happens, I say, simply by these little events in our life that produce a strong signal that confuses, the relationships between, this world and us. So we actually soon, combine these simply because of the frame of reference that our brain is seeking evidence in. So of course, the reason this is happening is that voices are trying to create conflict. So they're creating conflict in the mind because that's what keeps us engaged with them, keeps our attention, keeps us engaged with them, else we would just dismiss them. And of course, if you look at our history, they've done nothing but create conflict. For me, our experience of this throughout our history is clearly not good for us. I see it as a crime against humanity. And again, I say this with all respect. I have no problem with individuals that believe in a loving God. Actually, I would prefer it if you just believed in love. because this character that's claimed to be God also created this character, the devil. And of course, I see no purpose for evil at all, whether it's part of this miserable character's plan or not. If plan is part of his evil, but if evil is part of his plan, then suffering is part of his plan. I don't believe in suffering either, because I believe in love and because I believe in respect. I don't believe in any of those. And of course, this is what happening. This thing has just asserted this dominance over our world. And for me, they've done this by just claiming omnipotence. And quite frankly, if this entity is omnipotent, would I be here saying this to you? Probably not. One other way of looking at it. So, of course, what we need to do is kind of reject all these ideas, as I say, particularly because they reinforce the hideousness of this experience. If you believe these characters are actually real. So, once again, thank you for listening to this video. If you're able to help me keep some of this, most of this free for people who hear voices, please contribute anything you can on my fundraiser at crowdrise.com. It's called Someone You Know Hears Voices. If you want to comment on social media, please use #MadSense. If you'd like to work together, greg@mad-sense.com. Sign up on our website, and of course, remember that these people are very active in making a difference in this space as well, and would also welcome contributions. So thanks for listening.